Tell us in the comments which city you're listening from. Click the like button, and let's begin the story. The rain fell in sheets that November night when Daniel made the choice that would haunt two lives forever. He stood across the street from the Castellano mansion, hidden beneath the skeletal branches of an oak tree, watching the golden light spill from the windows onto the manicured lawn. His younger brother Lucas sat on the front steps, exactly where Daniel had positioned him 5 minutes earlier, clutching a worn teddy bear against his chest. The boy was 9 years old, small for his age, dark hair plastered to his forehead by the rain. He hadn't moved since Daniel told him to wait there. "I'll be right back," Daniel had said. "I just need to talk to someone inside. Don't move, okay?" Lucas had nodded, trusting, always trusting. That trust was about to be shattered. Daniel watched as the front door opened and Richard Castellano appeared, framed by the warm interior light. The man was in his 50s, gray at the temples, wearing an expensive sweater and holding a glass of wine. He had been about to close his gate for the night when he noticed the small figure huddled on his steps. Richard approached slowly, confused. "Hello? Are you lost?" Lucas looked up, rain dripping from his chin. "My brother said to wait here." "Your brother? Where is he?" The boy turned, searching the darkness for Daniel's familiar shape. But Daniel had already stepped back, deeper into the shadows. Richard knelt beside Lucas, his voice gentle but concerned. "How long have you been sitting here?" "I don't know. He said he'd be right back." Richard looked around the empty street, saw no one, then noticed a small backpack beside the child. He picked it up, opened it. Clean clothes, carefully folded. A toothbrush. A photograph of two boys, this child and an older teenager. Nothing else. No note. No explanation. No emergency contact. Richard's expression shifted from confusion to understanding, then to something darker. Anger, perhaps. Or recognition of something he had seen before in his work with social services. This wasn't a child waiting for his brother to return from an errand. This was abandonment. "What's your name?" Richard asked quietly. "Lucas." "And your brother's name?" "Daniel." Richard lifted the boy, gently. "Let's get you inside. You're freezing." As they disappeared through the front door, Daniel allowed himself one final look at his brother's small silhouette against the light. Then he turned and walked away into the rain, each step feeling like a knife dragging through his chest. He didn't look back. If he had, he might have seen Lucas break free from Richard's gentle grip and run back to the steps, screaming his name into the darkness. He might have heard the raw terror in that 9-year-old voice calling for him. He might have turned around, but Daniel kept walking, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached, because if he stopped for even 1 second, he would run back and destroy the only chance Lucas had at survival. 5 blocks away, Daniel collapsed against a brick wall in an alley and vomited until there was nothing left inside him but the hollowness of what he had just done. He had abandoned his brother, the one person in the world who depended on him completely, the one person who loved him without condition. And he had left him like garbage on a stranger's doorstep. Daniel pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket. On it was written Richard Castellano's full name, his business holdings, his home address, and one critical detail Daniel had discovered after 3 months of research. Richard had lost his only son, Michael, in a car accident 7 years earlier and had never recovered from the loss. Richard Castellano was a good man who had spent the last 7 years trying to fill the void his son's death had left behind. He donated to children's charities. He volunteered at youth centers. He had even tried to adopt twice, but both times had backed out at the last moment, unable to face the idea of replacing Michael. Daniel had studied this man's life with the intensity of someone preparing for war, because that's what this was, a war to save his brother's future, even if it meant destroying Lucas's ability to ever trust him again. Daniel had calculated everything. Richard wouldn't call the police immediately. He would bring Lucas inside, feed him, try to understand the situation. And when no one came to claim the boy, when it became clear that Lucas had nowhere else to go, Richard's guilt and his unresolved grief would do the rest. He would keep Lucas, not out of obligation, but because saving this abandoned child might finally give meaning to the loss of his own son. Daniel had gambled his brother's entire future on this psychological calculation, and now there was no going back. He crumpled the paper and let it fall into a puddle, watching the ink bleed into illegibility. Then he stood, pulled his jacket tighter against the cold, and began the long walk to the public hospital on the other side of the city, where he had an appointment he could no longer afford to miss. The appointment that would confirm what he already knew, that he was dying, and that he had perhaps 3 months left to make sure Lucas never found out. 3 months earlier, Daniel had been working 2 jobs to keep them alive. Morning shifts at a warehouse, loading trucks until his back screamed. Evening shifts cleaning office buildings, pushing a mop through empty hallways while the world outside went dark. Lucas never knew how bad things were. Daniel made sure of it. He made sure Lucas had breakfast before school, even if Daniel skipped eating entirely. He made sure Lucas had clean clothes, even if it meant Daniel wore the same shirt 3 days straight. He made sure Lucas smiled, even if Daniel was drowning. Their mother had overdosed when Lucas was 7. She had been fighting addiction for years, in and out of rehab, in and out of their lives. When she finally died, Daniel had been 15, old enough to understand that the state would separate them if anyone found out they were alone. So he lied. He forged his mother's signature on school documents. He paid rent in cash, so there would be no paper trail. He told neighbors his mother worked night shifts. For 2 years, he kept them invisible. And it worked until the headaches started. At first, Daniel ignored them. Tension, he told himself. Stress. He was 17, working 60 hours a week, raising a child, barely sleeping. Of course, his head hurt, but the headaches became migraines. The migraines became moments of blurred vision. The blurred vision became nosebleeds that wouldn't stop. One morning, he woke up to find blood on his pillow. That's when he finally went to the free clinic. The doctor was a tired woman in her 40s who had seen too many cases like his. Young, poor, uninsured, waiting until it was too late. She ordered tests, blood work, imaging. 2 weeks later, she sat across from Daniel in a windowless examination room and told him he had acute lymphoblastic leukemia, advanced stage, aggressive, the kind that could have been treated if caught early. But now, how long? Daniel asked. The doctor hesitated. With aggressive treatment, chemotherapy, possible bone marrow transplant, you could have years. Without treatment, months, maybe 6, maybe less. How much does treatment cost? The doctor looked down at her hands. More than you have. Daniel nodded slowly. He had expected this. Are there programs? Financial assistance? There are, but the waiting lists are long, and your case is urgent. How urgent? You should start treatment within the month. Daniel stood. Thank you for your time. Wait, the doctor said. There are options. Payment plans. Charity care applications. Let me connect you with our social worker. And what happens to my brother while I'm in treatment? Daniel interrupted. The doctor blinked. Your brother. I'm his legal guardian. He's 9. If I go into treatment, if I can't work, where does he go? There are services. Foster care, Daniel said flatly. You mean foster care? The doctor said nothing. Daniel walked out of that clinic knowing exactly what his choice was. He could fight for his own life and lose Lucas to the system. Or he could use whatever time he had left to make sure Lucas had a future that didn't involve group homes, neglect, and the same cycle of poverty that had destroyed their mother. The decision was easier than it should have been. Over the following weeks, Daniel began planning the most important thing he would ever do. He researched wealthy individuals in the city who had experienced personal tragedy. He cross-referenced their charitable activities, their public statements, their behavioral patterns. Richard Castellano's name appeared again and again. Widowed, childless after his son's death, wealthy enough that raising one more child would be effortless, psychologically vulnerable enough that an abandoned boy might trigger a protective instinct he couldn't ignore. Daniel got himself hired as a night janitor in the office building where Richard's company had their headquarters. He observed. He learned Richard's schedule, his habits, his route home. He learned that Richard stopped at the same coffee shop every morning, that he volunteered at a youth mentorship program on Thursdays, that he still kept his dead son's bedroom exactly as it had been the day of the accident. He learned that Richard Castellano was a good man drowning in unresolved grief, searching for meaning in a life that had lost its center. And Daniel understood that if he played this correctly, Lucas wouldn't just survive, he would thrive. But it required Daniel to become the villain in his brother's story. It required him to break Lucas's heart so completely that the boy would have no choice but to accept Richard's love as a replacement. Because if Lucas spent his childhood waiting for Daniel to come back, he would never move forward. He would never heal. He would never let Richard become his father. So Daniel made the hardest choice a 17-year-old could make. He decided to disappear completely, without explanation, without goodbye. He would let Lucas believe he had been abandoned by the one person who should have protected him. And he would do it knowing that Lucas would hate him, knowing that Lucas would spend years wondering what he did wrong, knowing that the last memory his brother would have of him would be betrayal. Daniel spent his final weeks preparing for that night. He bought Lucas new clothes with money he couldn't afford to spend. He packed the teddy bear Lucas had owned since he was 3, the one their mother had given him before things got bad. He wrote a letter, long detailed, explaining everything, and sealed it in an envelope with specific instructions. Then he walked Lucas to Richard Castellano's front steps and broke both their hearts in a single moment. The first month after the abandonment, Lucas screamed himself hoarse every night. Richard didn't know what to do. The boy wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak. He sat by the window for hours, watching the street, waiting for a brother who would never return. Child services had been called. They investigated. They found no record of Daniel, no address, no contact information. The boy Lucas described might as well have been a ghost. Richard hired private investigators. They found nothing. Daniel had erased himself. After 6 weeks of searching, Richard sat down with Lucas in the living room and spoke to him with the kind of honesty adults rarely give children. "I don't know why your brother left you here," Richard said, "but I promise you this, you will never be abandoned again. You can stay with me for as long as you need. And if you'll let me, I'd like to take care of you, not as a replacement for Daniel, but as someone who understands what it feels like to lose the person you love most." Lucas looked at him with eyes that had aged far beyond 9 years. "Why would you want me?" Richard's voice cracked. "Because I lost my son, and I don't want to lose another child." That night, Lucas cried for the first time since the abandonment, and slowly, painfully, he began to let Richard in. 5 years passed. Lucas grew up in the Castellano mansion, surrounded by everything Daniel could never have provided. Private tutors, music lessons, family vacations, a bedroom larger than the entire apartment they had shared. Richard was patient, kind. He never tried to replace Daniel, but he gave Lucas something Daniel couldn't: stability, security, and unconditional love that didn't depend on sacrifice. But the question never left Lucas's mind. Why? Why had Daniel abandoned him? What had Lucas done to deserve being left behind? Richard hired therapists. They helped Lucas process the trauma, build coping mechanisms, develop healthy attachments. But no amount of therapy could answer the question that haunted him. On Lucas's 14th birthday, Richard took him to his private study after dinner. "There's something I need to give you," Richard said. He unlocked a desk drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed slightly with age. Lucas's name was written on the front in handwriting he recognized instantly. "Daniel's. This was left in your backpack the night you arrived," Richard said quietly. "There was a note attached to it, written for me. It said I should give this to you on your 14th birthday, not before." Lucas's hands trembled as he took the envelope. He came back. Lucas whispered, "No, this was left that same night, in the backpack." Lucas stared at the envelope, his heart pounding. For 5 years, he had believed Daniel disappeared without explanation. But Daniel had left him a message meant to be read exactly now. Do you want privacy? Richard asked gently. Lucas nodded, unable to speak. Richard left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Lucas sat alone in the study, holding the envelope that contained answers he had spent half his life searching for. He opened it with shaking hands. Inside were 6 pages, handwritten, some of the words smudged as if they had been written through tears. The letter began, Lucas, if you're reading this, it means Richard kept his promise and gave you this letter on your 14th birthday. It means you've been with him for 5 years. It means you're safe, healthy, and hopefully happy. It also means I've been dead for almost 5 years. I'm writing this 3 days before I leave you at Richard's house. I'm 17 years old. I'm dying of leukemia, and I have maybe 3 months left to live. Lucas stopped reading. The words blurred. He read the sentence again, forcing his brain to process what it said. I'm dying of leukemia. No, that wasn't possible. He kept reading, his heart shattering with every line. I found out 2 months ago. The doctors said treatment might give me more time, but it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars we don't have. Even with financial assistance, even with payment plans, I would spend whatever time I had left in hospitals, too sick to take care of you. And you would end up in foster care. I couldn't let that happen, Lucas. I've seen what the system does to kids like us. I've heard the stories, and I knew that if I died while you were still my responsibility, you'd be lost in that system forever. So I started looking for another option. I'm not smart enough for college. I'm not talented enough for some miraculous success story. But I'm observant, and I'm desperate. And I realized that the only way to save you was to find someone who could give you everything I couldn't. That's how I found Richard. The letter went on to describe everything Daniel had done. The research, the planning, the job as a janitor just to study Richard's life. I learned that he lost his son 7 years ago. I learned that he spent every day since trying to fill that emptiness. I learned that he's a good man who has more love to give than he knows what to do with. But I also knew he wouldn't take you if I just asked. He would offer temporary help, maybe some financial assistance, but he wouldn't commit to raising you, not without something forcing him to make that choice. So I made it impossible for him to say no. I left you on his doorstep with no explanation, no way to contact me, no option but to take responsibility for you or call the police. And I gambled that his grief and his goodness would make him choose you. Lucas read through tears that made the words swim on the page. I know what I did to you, Lucas. I know I broke your heart. I know you've spent years wondering why I abandoned you, what you did wrong, why you weren't enough. None of this was your fault. You were everything. You were the only reason I kept going after Mom died. Every morning, I woke up exhausted, and the only thing that got me out of bed was knowing you needed me. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I loved you more than my own life. And I knew that if I stayed, if I let you watch me die, you would carry that trauma forever. You would blame yourself. You would think you could have saved me. So I made myself the villain instead. I let you think I abandoned you, so you would never have to know I was dying. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. I won't have suffered long. The doctors said once it gets bad, it goes fast. I'll have died in a public hospital under a fake name, so no one could trace me back to you. You'll never have to see my grave. You'll never have to carry the weight of my death. All you have to carry is the memory of a brother who loved you enough to break your heart. The final page was the hardest to read. I visited the mansion twice after I left you there. Once, 3 weeks later. I was already getting sicker. I had to take 2 buses to get there. I stood across the street and watched you playing in the yard with Richard. You were laughing, actually laughing, and I knew I made the right choice. The second time was 6 weeks later. I was in bad shape by then. I could barely walk, but I needed to see you one more time. You were on the front porch reading a book. Richard was sitting beside you. He said something, and you smiled. That smile told me everything I needed to know. You were going to be okay. So I went back to the hospital and I stopped fighting. I let go because my job was done. I'm writing this letter now because I need you to understand something. What I did wasn't abandonment. It was love. The deepest, most painful love I've ever known. I gave you the only thing I had left to give, a future. And it cost me everything. But I would do it again. 1,000 times over, I would do it again. Live your life, Lucas. Be happy. Love Richard the way he deserves to be loved. Don't spend your time mourning me or hating me. Just live. And know that somewhere, in whatever comes after this, I'm watching. And I'm proud of you. I love you, little brother. I always will. Daniel. Lucas sat in that study for 3 hours, reading and rereading the letter until he had memorized every word. When Richard finally knocked softly on the door, Lucas looked up with a face ravaged by tears. He was dying, Lucas whispered. He was dying, and he never told me. Richard crossed the room and pulled Lucas into his arms. And Lucas understood finally that the abandonment that had defined his childhood had actually been the greatest act of love anyone had ever given him. His brother hadn't thrown him away. His brother had sacrificed everything, his health, his dignity, his relationship with the only family he had, to make sure Lucas had a chance. The next day, Lucas asked Richard to help him find where Daniel was buried. It took weeks of searching through hospital records, death certificates filed under false names, unclaimed bodies processed through the county. Finally, they found him. Daniel Reyes died 3 months after Lucas had been left at the mansion. Buried in a public cemetery with no headstone, no flowers, no one to mourn him. Lucas stood at the unmarked grave with Richard beside him, and he made a promise. "I'm going to make your sacrifice mean something," Lucas said quietly. "I'm going to live the life you gave me, and I'm going to make sure no other kid has to choose between dying alone and saving their family." Richard placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "What do you mean?" Lucas looked up at him. "I want to start a foundation for kids with 6 siblings, so they don't have to make the choice Daniel made." Richard smiled through tears. "Then we'll start it together." 6 years later, Lucas stood in front of a crowd at the opening of the Daniel Reyes Foundation headquarters. He was 20 years old now, confident, driven, studying medicine with the goal of specializing in pediatric oncology. Richard sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Lucas had spent years processing his grief, his guilt, his complicated love for the brother who had saved him in the most devastating way possible. And he had learned something about sacrifice, that sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who hurt us to protect us. That sometimes the cruelest thing someone can do is actually the kindest. That love isn't always soft and gentle. Sometimes love is brutal, painful, and looks exactly like abandonment. As Lucas spoke to the crowd about the Foundation's mission, to provide financial and emotional support to families dealing with pediatric terminal illness, he looked down at the folded letter he always carried in his pocket. The letter Daniel had written knowing he would never see Lucas read it. And Lucas understood, finally and completely, that he had never been abandoned. He had been loved, so deeply, so fiercely, that his brother had chosen to become the villain in Lucas's story, so that Lucas could have a hero. Richard Castellano had given Lucas stability, education, and a future. But Daniel had given him something even more profound. He had given him life itself. And Lucas would spend the rest of his own life making sure that sacrifice was never forgotten.